In the third month of the fierce siege, the atmosphere inside the key coastal citadel had become extremely stifling. Pillars of black smoke from the warehouses hit by stone projectiles were still rising intensely, mingling with the moldy smell of decay and hunger. The reserve food provisions, originally calculated for 6 months of holding out, had depleted rapidly due to the excessive number of refugees flooding in from the early days of hostilities. Now, the ration of each soldier was only a handful of moldy rice per day. On the jagged ramparts full of cracks, groups of weary sentries, armor tattered, still tried to maintain vigilance. Their dark-circled eyes looked out toward the vast plain outside, where the enemy was stationed, the western city wall, where the most violent assault waves were sustained last month, was now seriously collapsed, only temporarily reinforced by rows of wooden stakes and earth bags piled up in a hurried manner. Outside the defensive moat which had dried up, the encampment of the Southern Alliance Grand Army stretched as far as the eye could see, a sea of people in tents estimated to be over 50,000 troops. The sound of battle drums and animal horn bugles occasionally resonated, echoing into the city like ceaseless death threats. Dozens of giant stone-throwing machines were erected about 300 steps from the foot of the wall, leverage arms reaching high up into the gray sky, ready to pour down a rain of boulders at any moment. The Southern Light Cavalry patrol squads, riding on agile warhorses, continuously scouring around the area, tightly blockading every road, ruthlessly intercepting every smallest effort of communication or supply from the outside. In the dark main hall of the command manor, the defending generals met to discuss in a bleak and desperate atmosphere. They understood clearly that if there was no change, the city would fall within less than 7 days when strength and resources were exhausted. Carrier pigeons had been released continuously throughout the past 90 days, carrying urgent pleas for help sent to the capital of the Western Empire, but responding to them was only a terrifying silence from the distant horizon. Hope for a relief army was gradually fading, until the dawn of the 91st day revealed an unusual sign on the northern horizon. As the sunlight began to beat straight down on the vast plain, a giant cloud of dust billowed up from the north, obscuring an entire corner of the horizon. The trembling of the ground was initially just like distant thunder, but quickly became distinct, turning into the steady and terrifying rhythm of tens of thousands of marching footsteps at once. From within that blinding dust screen, crimson banners embroidered with golden eagles began to emerge, fluttering in the early breeze. That was the unmistakable signal of the Western Empire's main army. 30,000 soldiers equipped with shining armor entered the battlefield with steel discipline. In the center of the formation was a block of heavy infantry arranged in 15 horizontal rows, each soldier carrying a large rectangular shield and a short spear, forming a glittering metal wall stretching more than 2 miles. On both flanks was the supporting cavalry force, war horses lightly armored, the cavalrymen gripping long lances, ready to accelerate at any moment. The army moved slowly but surely, showing no signs of fatigue after the long march, exuding the overwhelming aura of a professional conquering force. The sudden appearance of this huge relief army caused great disturbance in the ranks of the Southern Alliance army. The sounds of alarm bugles rang out urgently, tearing apart the quiet space of the morning. The generals commanding the siege force were forced to order soldiers to turn their backs to the citadel, hastily rotating the formation to face the new threat from behind. Thousands of Southern infantrymen rushed madly to establish a new defense line, dragging heavy stone-throwing chariots to turn around with difficulty. On the high ramparts of the besieged citadel, weak cheers began to ring out when they saw the forest of spears of their home army. However, the atmosphere quickly became extremely tense when the two grand armies began to array their formations facing each other on the plain, only about 500 steps apart. The gap between the two corps now became a dead zone, where death was waiting to harvest lives. The rhythmic shield banging of 30,000 Imperial troops rang out like a steely challenge, signaling a bloody massacre was about to begin. Before the giant infantry blocks of both sides could collide, the sharp sound of bugles from the left flank of the Imperial relief force issued the order for a preemptive strike. About 2,000 light cavalrymen equipped with round shields and short spears, immediately separated from the main formation, surged forward like arrows shot from a bow. Their mission was not to thrust straight into the enemy's center, but to harass and break the will of the opposing flanks before the great battle truly began. Responding to that provocation from the Southern Alliance side, the most battle-hardened steppe cavalry squads were also thrown into the battle. Not wearing heavy armor like their opponents, the Southern cavalry wore only coarse cloth tunics, riding on small but extremely agile and resilient horses. Two waterfalls of men and horses crashed into each other on the open strip of land between the two battle lines, creating a blinding screen of dust obscuring even the sunlight, though there were no terrifying frontal collisions of armored cavalry. This opening battle was a race of speed and precision. The Imperial cavalry galloped in a horizontal formation, simultaneously launching thousands of sharp javelins at the opponent when the distance was only a few dozen steps. The sound of the wind hissed horribly, followed by the dry crashing sound of iron tips into wooden shields, and the screams of the wounded tumbling to the ground. However, the Southern cavalry, with skillful riding techniques, quickly scattered. They rode in circles while shooting poisoned arrows backward at the pursuers, creating an extremely annoying guerrilla tactic. The ground shook violently under the iron hooves of over 4,000 war horses tramping in chaos. Bodies of men and horses began to lie scattered on the grass, blood soaking red an entire dusty area. There were cavalrymen who fell off their horses before they could stand up, were trampled mercilessly by the hooves of both sides. The Imperial cavalry squads tried to close angles to force the enemy into the firing range of the infantry behind. But the Southern cavalry was slippery like eels, continuously appearing and disappearing in the dust screen, fighting while retreating to lure the enemy deeper. The skirmish lasted nearly an hour without a clear winner, but had turned the land between the two corps into a muddy field full of obstacles of corpses. The bugle sound for withdrawal finally rang out from both sides, signaling the cavalry forces to scatter to the two flanks, yielding the bloody stage to the giant steel masses moving rumblingly behind. Meanwhile, at the center of the Southern Army formation, the generals had quietly prepared a deadly trap to welcome the enemy infantry block. While the thick dust from the cavalry skirmish was still hovering and obscuring the view, the commanding generals of the Southern Alliance quickly issued orders to change tactics. They understood well that a head-on confrontation of muscle power against the heavy armored infantry block of the Empire on flat terrain was tantamount to suicide. Therefore, a tactical retreat order was issued. The entire Southern Center Army began to move back about 300 steps to a strip of land slightly sloping higher than the general ground level. At this new position, thousands of engineers and slaves following the army immediately rushed to work at a frantic speed. Iron shovels and pickaxes struck the dry, barren ground mercilessly, creating a trench about 5 yards wide and waist-deep for an adult in just a short time. At the bottom of the trench, sharpened wooden and bamboo stakes, originally prepared for siege, were now planted upside down, bristling like a forest of spikes, ready to pierce the feet of anyone daring to cross. Immediately behind the trench, obstacle fences made of large oak trunks interwoven in a zigzag pattern were dragged from the camp and arranged in 3 dense layers. Their purpose was to break up the opponent's tight formation, forcing the attacking soldiers to separate and expose their flanks. Interspersed between the gaps of the fence were squads of long-shield soldiers, wielding battle axes and daggers ready to slaughter those who got stuck. Behind that hastily erected field fortification layer, 3 blocks of Southern archers and crossbowmen had finished arranging a curved firing formation. They stuck tens of thousands of arrows into the soft soil right in front of them for convenient continuous reloading, creating black cold carpets of arrow forest. Small stone-throwing chariots, more flexible than the siege type, were also pushed up to high mounds by shouting soldiers, loaded with ceramic jars filled with kerosene and sharp pottery shards. The entire battlefield quickly turned into a giant death trap. The air was thick with the smell of fresh earth and extreme tension. The Southern troops held their breath waiting, hands gripping weapons tightly, eyes staring at the steel wall of the Imperial army looming forward. each step stomping down, simultaneously shaking the whole plain, like a giant monster voluntarily walking into a tiger's mouth, facing the defense system thick with traps. The heavy infantry block of the Western Empire did not flinch or slow down. When the distance was shortened to 150 steps, a unison shout rang out from the first rank, spreading to the rear like a sea wave. Immediately, 15 rows of troops simultaneously raised their oversized rectangular shields, the shield edge overlapping that shield edge, forming a tight metal dome, completely shielding all 30,000 people underneath. From the high mound, thousands of southern bowstrings released simultaneously. The sky darkened in an instant by a black cloud of arrows pouring down like a waterfall. The sound of metal clashing clattered deafeningly as the rain of death poured down on the moving steel roof below. Most arrows slid off or shattered on the smooth shield surfaces. Only a few tips penetrated through the narrow gaps, embedding into the shoulders or legs of unlucky soldiers, but those gaps were immediately filled by the person behind, not revealing any weakness. When reaching the edge of the spike trench, the shield formation suddenly separated at a few points. Suicide engineer squads rushed up, carrying large bundles of dry branches and sacks of earth on their shoulders, throwing them hurriedly into the trench to cover the sharp spikes. Kerosene jars thrown from the southern side ignited fiercely, turning the trench section into a river of fire. The smell of burnt flesh mingled with the smell of tree resin rising strongly. But the ironclad stream of people still trudged past the bodies of comrades, stepping on the burning bundles of wood to overcome the first obstacle. The most terrifying collision sound rang out when the first line of Imperial shields crashed into the zigzag oak barricade layer, the pressure from tens of thousands of people behind piled onto the shoulders of those in front, turning them into living sledgehammers ramming down the wooden stakes. Through the gaps of the fence, the short spears of the Imperial army thrust out repeatedly with deadly accuracy, plunging into the bellies and necks of the southern axe soldiers who were defending. Fresh blood began to dye the wooden bars red and soak the muddy ground. The skirmish turned into a brutal tug-of-war at extremely close range. Southern troops frantically used axes to chop down on shield rims to break the opponent's formation, while Imperial infantry stoically endured the impact, waiting for an opening to launch decisive thrusts from below. The fortified defense line began to shake violently under the unstoppable pressure of the giant steel mass, seeming like it was about to crumble at any moment. Then a strange, deep and creepy bugle sound suddenly rang out from the dense forest on the right flank of the Imperial army. From the dense forest edge on the right flank, 30 giant beasts stepped out, looming large, each one like a mobile tower of flesh and iron. That was the legendary war elephant herd of the southern tropics, now clad in thick armor of tanned buffalo hide and bronze plates covering the head and chest. On the back of each beast was a square wooden tower carrying 4 sharpshooter crossbowmen, while the curved tusks in front were clad in sharp steel, 5 yards long, shining a cold color. The ground shook with an intensity even more terrible than when cavalry charged. The elephant herd did not run fast, but the momentum of the 1,000-pound mass of flesh created a suffocating pressure. When the soldiers on the right flank of the Imperial formation realized the danger and turned their spear points to the flank, it was already too late. The leading beasts crashed into the densely packed infantry ranks with the power of a landslide. The sound of the first collision was the shattering of wood and bone. The solid shield wall, the pride of the Western Army, crumbled like pottery shards under the feet of the beast herd. Heavily armored soldiers were tossed into the air like rag dolls, or were trampled flat under large feet spread out like giant stone mortars. Blood and mud mixed together, splashing up as high as the wooden tower on the elephant's back. The elephant herd frantically plowed through the enemy formation, using trunks strong as giant pythons to knock down anyone standing within reach, or curling around them and throwing them forcefully against boulders. The steel-clad tusks became reapers' scythes. Each head toss of the animal was a bloody plow path piercing through layers of troops, leaving behind intact corpses. From above, Southern archers calmly poured arrows down onto the panicked heads below, turning troop gathering points into death zones. The disciplined battle formation of the 30,000 Imperial troops began to break from the right flank. Terror spread faster than fire, as soldiers in the rear pushed each other to make way for the unstoppable monsters. The forward defense line of the Southern Army, taking advantage of this chaotic opportunity, cheered and counterattacked, squeezing the Imperial Army into a position between hammer and anvil, between the obstacle fence and the frenzied elephant herd. While the right flank was on the verge of total disintegration, a sharp bugle call, quite different from previous commands, rang out from the center of the Imperial Army. Responding to that order, the rear ranks immediately spread out, making way for the special task Javelin Squad rushing out. These soldiers did not wear heavy armor or large shields. In their hands were bundles of pine resin torches burning furiously, and clay jars filled with a mixture of oil and sulfur. With cold discipline, hundreds of special task soldiers simultaneously threw fireballs at the aggressively destroying beasts. The clay jars shattered upon impact with the leather armor or wooden towers on the elephants' backs. The oil spread and caught fire immediately, creating halos of fire engulfing the giant animals. The smell of burning hair and the pungent smell of roasting meat rose up, mingling with the pathetic trumpet roars of the elephant herd as the flames licked into the most sensitive flesh parts. The primal instinct of fear of fire rose strongly, overriding human training. The elephants' frantically butting heads suddenly stopped, shaking their heads violently to throw off the fire spots clinging to their bodies. At that very moment, the second rain of javelins arrived. This time, the target was not the thick skin, but the fatal weak points. The exposed large eyes, the soft trunk, and the mahouts sitting precariously on the elephants' necks. The short spears with sharp iron tips plunged into trunks and eyes, making the beasts go mad with pain. On the elephants' backs, the controllers were hit by arrows one by one and fell headfirst to the ground, leaving the giant war machines completely out of control in the middle of the battlefield. With no one to restrain them and surrounded by fire on all sides, the panicked elephant herd turned their heads to flee by instinct, charging straight towards the rear where the Southern infantry was following to support. The battlefield situation reversed in the blink of an eye. The Southern soldiers who were cheering victory a minute ago, now terrified, threw away their weapons and fled before the thunderous footsteps of their own allies. The blind elephants trampled on their home army formation, knocking over stone-throwing chariots and trampling hundreds of infantrymen crowding to find a way out. At the same time, from the city gate that had been closed for the past 3 months, a huge explosion rang out like thunder, signaling the participation of a third force. The 3-inch thick ironwood gate, which had been shut tight like a tomb for the past 90 days, now burst open wide after the last locking bars were hurriedly removed. From the deep sucking darkness of the gate arch, a torrent of gaunt, haggard people but bearing eyes burning with hatred rushed out. That was the last 5,000 soldiers still capable of fighting of the defending side. Those who had drained the last remnant strength from meager rations to execute this death-defying counterattack. There were no ostentatious trumpets or drums. They rushed forward in the hoarse screams of suppressed despair. The first target of this death army was not the enemy main infantry block, but the siege equipment assembly area located right next to the foot of the wall. Hundreds of torches were thrown mercilessly at the stone-throwing machines and towering wooden towers, because they were made of dry wood exposed to sun and wind for a long time. These giant war machines caught fire immediately, flaring up into giant torches, dyeing an entire corner of the afternoon sky with a deadly orange color. The logistics and engineering forces of the Southern Alliance, who were absorbed in watching the battle in the distance, were completely taken by surprise by this bold rear attack. The technical soldiers, wearing no armor, holding only hammers and wooden wedges, quickly became victims of the fury from the defending side. Blunt swords and broken spears were swung madly, striking down without hesitation. Blood of the engineers mixed with the lubricating grease of the machines, creating a slippery mud layer right at the foot of the burning watchtowers. Realizing the rear was attacked, the Southern Alliance commanding generals hurriedly deployed 2 reserve wings to turn back to plug the gap. However, the chaos caused by the war elephants in the middle line had clogged all orders. The Southern light infantry units, when turning back, immediately clashed with the ghosts rushing out from the citadel. Although the defenders were physically exhausted, they fought with the mindset of having nothing left to lose, ready to throw their whole bodies onto enemy spears to create opportunities for comrades behind to advance. The melee took place brutally right next to the ashes of the siege camp. On one side were the well-fed but extremely confused. On the other were the starving but iron-willed. The defenders used everything they could grab to fight, from bricks, pottery shards to the very burning logs. They frantically tore apart the thin defense layer behind the enemy's back, creating a sharp spearhead thrusting straight into the flank of the Southern Grand Army. Now the besiegers had officially fallen into the most nightmarish formation of every strategist, being clamped tight between two steel pincers, one pressing in from the plain, one striking out from the citadel. The giant pincer officially closed when the heavy infantry block of the Western Empire, after reorganizing ranks before the retreat of the elephant herd, began to advance. With a deadly rhythm, the rapid battle drums mingled with the thunderous footsteps, squeezing tight the living space of the Southern Alliance army. On the opposite side, the remnants of the defenders, like wounded, hungry wolves, bit frantically into the exposed rear flank of the enemy, creating a steel encirclement with no way out. The Southern Grand Army, originally more than 50,000 strong, was now hemmed into a narrow strip of land less than 1,000 steps long. The overcrowding now became a death sentence. The soldiers in the center of the formation were pressed tightly against each other, to the point they could not lift their sword-holding arms. They were compressed by their own comrades who were panicking and backing up from the front, and those who were trying to flee from the rear. The sound of ribs shattering from the pressure and the screams of suffocation rang out louder than the clash of weapons. On the northern front, the Imperial shield wall operated like a ruthless meat grinder. The first line of soldiers used shields to knock down the opponents, while the second and third rows thrust short spears through the gaps with cold precision. Each of their steps left behind a carpet of corpses piled on top of each other. There were no heroic duels, only industrial-scale slaughter. The spear points just thrust out, retracted, staining red the shields that were originally shiny silver. Meanwhile, on the southern front near the foot of the wall, the battle took place much more chaotically and barbarically. The defenders without good armor rushed into close combat with daggers and short axes. They weaved between the clumsy legs of the southern long spear soldiers, cutting hamstrings and stabbing into the gaps of enemy armor. Blood flowed into large puddles, turning the dusty ground into thick red mud, causing even those standing firm to slip and be trampled to death. Southern generals tried to order troops to scatter to the two flanks to break the siege, but their signal flags were quickly swallowed in the chaotic sea of people. The Alliance's sun-embroidered flags fell one by one, trampled under the feet of the mutinous soldiers. No formation left, no discipline left, only naked survival instinct remained. Even the most battle-hardened mercenaries began to discard heavy weapons, shoving comrades to find a way to escape. But every direction was blocked by a bristling forest of spears. The circle just kept tightening moment by moment. Looking down from above, the Southern Army formation looked like a giant beast writhing in pain as it was butchered from both ends. Black smoke from the burning siege towers curled up, obscuring the late afternoon sunlight, creating a blurry hell-on-earth scene, where desperate cries mingled with the clash of iron and steel into a gruesome symphony of war. The final organized resistance of the Southern Alliance Army concentrated at the Central Core, where the battle-hardened mercenary corps from the desert tribes was stationed. More than 5,000 of these experienced warriors, with characteristic round leather shields and crescent-curved swords, tried to huddle together into a desperate circular defensive formation. They braced themselves to withstand waves of attacks from both sides, trying to buy time for high-ranking commanders to find a way to escape. However, before the suffocating pressure of the steel shield wall from the Imperial Army and the frantic recklessness of the defenders, this last island of resistance was also quickly submerged. The breaking point began when a corner of the mercenary formation was hit directly by an Imperial stone-throwing chariot, now pulled close to the front line. A large boulder weighing about 200 pounds fell down, crushing 5 soldiers and creating a fatal gap. Immediately, dozens of Imperial infantrymen flooded into that gap like floodwater breaking a dike. The tight defensive structure was broken from the inside. Fear spread faster than a plague, collapsing the little fighting spirit remaining of the mercenaries who fought only for gold, not for loyalty. The sound of metal falling, clanking onto the hard ground began to ring out sporadically, then quickly became a chaotic clattering sound. Even the fiercest desert warriors began to discard heavy shields and helmets, turning and running for their lives to save their own skins. The collapse of the most elite force created a catastrophic chain effect on the entire Southern Grand Army. No one listened to orders anymore. No one held position. 50,000 human beings turned into a panicked herd of beasts, trampling each other to find a way out. At the command flag area, Southern generals tried desperately to restore order. Their elite guards swung swords, cutting down the first deserters to deter others. Soldiers' blood splattered onto the general's robe. But that brutal act was just a drop in the bucket before the tsunami of fear. The crowd of soldiers, driven to a dead end, turned to attack their own commanders. They used their numbers to crush the guard unit, tearing the signal flags to shreds, and trampling on the bodies of the generals who had ordered their execution minutes ago. The mighty besieging army now disintegrated into tens of thousands of fragments scattered across the plain. The torrent of fleeing people rushed to the west, the only direction not yet completely clear, which led to the steep rocky coast full of reefs. They abandoned everything, provisions, looted gold and silver, and even wounded comrades who were moaning. Horse-drawn carriages carrying equipment were overturned. Horses had reins cut for riders to escape, creating huge obstacles blocking the path of their own army. The glorious scene of a conquering army was now just a pathetic picture of total and humiliating defeat. When the battle formation of the Southern Alliance army completely shattered, the battlefield shifted from the combat phase to the brutal pursuit phase. From both flanks of the Imperial infantry formation, over 4,000 cavalry, including light cavalry holding javelins and armored heavy cavalry, simultaneously spurred their horses to rush forward. They were like a pack of wolves unleashed, spilling through the gaps of the infantry to hunt down the prey, panicking and fleeing towards the coast. With absolute speed advantage, the Imperial cavalry quickly caught up with groups of infantry exhausted from fear and fatigue. No mercy was shown. The Western cavalrymen, with skillful swordsmanship, glided past the remnants and swung swords down from horseback. Slashes to the back and shoulders caused enemies to collapse immediately, creating trails of corpses stretching along the retreat route. Those trying to turn back to resist with short weapons were all trampled by iron-shod hooves, or pierced through the chest by long lances before reaching the rider. Meanwhile, the chaotic fleeing stream of people had been driven to a dead end at the edge of vertical cliffs near the coast, about 3 miles west of the main battlefield. In front was the deep sea rolling with violent waves. Behind were the cavalry swords closing the encirclement. In extreme desperation, hundreds of Southern soldiers chose to throw themselves from a height of dozens of yards onto the jagged reefs below. Their screams were quickly swallowed by the sound of ocean waves. The rest squeezed into a narrow strip of land along the shore, crowding each other to the point of suffocation, becoming target practice for the horse archer squads that just arrived. At the same time, in the main camp area of the besieging army, another Imperial cavalry wing carried out the final destruction mission. Thousands of torches were thrown into the endless rows of tents and huge food warehouses. The camp, built mainly of fabric and wood, burned fiercely in the strong sea breeze. The fire spread at terrible speed, creating a wall of fire more than a mile long, incinerating all the facilities that the Southern Army had painstakingly built over the past 3 months. Columns of thick black smoke curled up, covering the entire sunset sky, mingling with the burning smell of burnt fabric and the metallic smell of blood. The firelight from the enemy camp reflected on the sea surface, dyeing red the waves crashing on the rocky shore where the bodies of the defeated floated aimlessly. The pursuit lasted until darkness completely covered everything, turning the 50,000-strong army that once proudly besieged the city into the past. No unit left kept its flag or formation. The victory of the relief army was absolute and ruthless. completely wiping out the threat from the south on this land. As the last glowing red sunset sank completely behind the western horizon, the vast battlefield sank into a deadly night, illuminated only by the flickering firelight from the burning camps in the distance. The cheers, bugles, and deafening metal clashes of the day were now replaced by a sound even more haunting: the moans of thousands of wounded soldiers scattered across the plain, and the cawing of crows calling their flock in the smoke-filled sky. The scene on the field in front of the city gate was the most realistic painting of hell on earth. Under the pale moonlight just risen, piles of human and horse corpses stacked on top of each other, forming rugged mounds stretching for miles. The deep defensive trench that the Southern Army had painstakingly dug in the morning was now completely filled with their own bodies and ill-fated war horses. The giant war elephants, once the terror of every army, now lay dead like gray boulders, covered in arrows and spears, trunks still tightly wrapped around an enemy's corpse. At the area in front of the main city gate, the two final streams of people merged. The Western Empire heavy infantry block, having completed the sweep, reassembled into orderly ranks, even though their armor was dented and stained black with dried blood. Opposite them were the ragged skeletal defenders, eyes sunken from hunger, but still standing tall with the pride of survivors. There were no warm hugs or heroic speeches. Between them were only silent nods, respect radiating from the eyes of warriors who had walked through death's door together. Logistics and medical teams began moving onto the battlefield with crude stretchers and bright torches. They turned over each body, searching for comrades still breathing faintly in the mess of limbs and broken weapons. The smell of death began to rise strongly, blending with the smell of burning wood smoke and the fishy smell of the sea, creating a thick, stifling atmosphere signaling the horrific corpse cleanup days to come. On the highest watchtower of the citadel, the tattered flag of the defenders was slowly lowered, to be replaced by the brand new Golden Eagle flag of the relief army. Fluttering in the cold night wind, the siege lasting 3 full months had officially ended, leaving behind a blood-stained plain and a cruel lesson about the price of war, where victory is not measured in gold and silver, but by the lives of more than 40,000 people who forever lay on this land.